Hello and welcome back to Two Think Minimum. Today is Monday, November 7th, 2022. I'm Sarah O. Lamb, Senior Fellow at the Technology Policy Institute, and I'm joined by Scott Walston, TPI President and Senior Fellow. Today, we're delighted to have as our guest Sujit Raman. Sujit is General Counsel at TRM Labs, a leading blockchain and Web3 analytics company that helps organizations detect, assess, and investigate crypto-related fraud and financial crime. Previously, he was a partner at the international law firm Sidley Austin, where he focused his practice on cybersecurity and data privacy issues, internal investigations, and white-collar criminal defense. Earlier in his career, Mr. Raman served as an Associate Deputy Attorney General in the U.S. Department of Justice, and he also helped oversee the DOJ's cyber-related policy development. He represented the department on cyber matters before the National Security Council at the White House, and he co-led the U.S. delegation to the G6 Interior Ministers Conference in Munich. In addition, he oversaw the creation of the department's cryptocurrency enforcement framework, which remains federal law enforcement strategy blueprint for investigating crypto-related crime. And prior to DOJ's senior staff, he served for 8 years as a federal prosecutor. He has litigated several leading electronic evidence and digital privacy cases in the U.S. Court of Appeals. He's also a Marshall Scholar. Thanks, Sujit, for coming on. Like I was saying earlier, it's great to have somebody in crypto policy who has such deep DC experience.
Well, thanks very much, Sarah. It's great to be here. And, it's such an interesting time in crypto, in sort of the future of the international financial system. I'm just very grateful to be at a company like TRM that's in the middle of all of it, and also be talking to folks like you who obviously think about these issues a lot and have a lot to add to the conversation.
Great. So could you tell us a little bit more? You were at our TPI Aspen Forum this summer on our Web3 panel, and we were talking about, is crypto in a hype cycle or not? Is it crypto winter? Could you tell us more about TRM Labs business, how it's doing? Is it winter, or actually are you seeing an uptick in governmental and institutional demand for crypto software?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we're absolutely in a crypto winter in the sense of just looking at, prices, right? But from a building perspective, from, the perspective of a startup that's at the very active stages of building out the infrastructure of what Web3 might look like, or what the metaverse might look like, or what crypto in general looks like, these are very early days. And frankly, it's very exciting days. We are seeing continued interest and investment in the sort of layer one sort of blockchain protocols. As a company, we have been very lucky in that investors have been very interested in the work that we're doing. We'll have an announcement shortly about some additional fundraising that we've done as a company. So I think for particular companies in particular parts of the crypto sort of ecosystem, this is a very important time, and it really is a time of growth. We are seeing a lot of sort of projects that are getting closer scrutiny, greater support, but I think we're also seeing some of the more, maybe the more fanciful projects falling a little bit by the wayside. So I think, as we saw in the last crypto winter a couple of years ago, that's when a lot of companies, for example, like Coinbase, really made the infrastructure investments that made them such powerful entrants into the public markets. I would not be surprised to see a similar kind of building development right now.
So a little bit more, where do you see the future of crypto and Web3? So Fidelity and JP Morgan recently opened up like crypto desks and DeFi products in response to, I guess, investor demand. And that's like major, I think, for institutional interest. But then there's also a drop in transaction volumes at Coinbase and Robinhood. Do you see any kind of big shifts? There's also more news, even this morning, a little tiff between the Binance and Sam Bankman, FTX. So who do you see as big players? What's the future of all this?
Well, you made a really interesting point at the very beginning there, Sarah, just about how institutional, sort of traditional financial institutions are increasingly dipping their toe, and not just dipping their toe, actually, putting substantial amounts of money into the crypto sort of infrastructure, right? As a company, TRM, our investors are quite diverse, but we have significant and well-known financial institutions that support us. So I think what we're seeing is financial institutions, sort of traditional financial institutions, recognizing that in many ways, this really is the future of money, the future of transferring funds between people across borders, at the speed of the internet. And I think they want to be part of that. They want to help shape that. So how long will that take? That is very much an open question. And there are, background regulatory questions there. There are questions like, what's currently happening in the Ukraine. There's a lot of geopolitical impacts in all of this that are hard to predict in many ways. But I am a firm believer that this is a part of the economy that's going to continue to grow. And it's just because of the obvious reasons, right? I mean, when you think about internet-based money, that seems like the most obvious concept, right? As we have increasing amounts of, smartphones in people's hands, we have, again, greater grow out of the internet and just general dissatisfaction with intermediaries and the sort of fees and the extra costs that are associated, the friction that does not have to be there when you have an internet of money. But there's a whole regulatory framework. You're concerned about illicit actors. So there's a lot that still needs to be worked out. But again, I am very confident that this is an area that will continue to grow.
So I'm going to play the straight man here, not knowing as much as either of you. And I want to ask the question that people have been asking since we first started talking about it, which is, what problem is this solving? I have no trouble spending money on the internet. I could probably use some more transactions cost to spend less. Obviously not. But what is the problem that's to be solved? And why is this the answer?
So it's a great question, Scott. I think one sort of immediate response that I often have when people ask me that question is, if you have, let's say, family members who live in other parts of the world, think about how much time and expense it takes, let's say, to send a wire transfer to Australia or to India or to Indonesia. You could initiate that wire on a Thursday, and 4, 5, 6, 7 days later, the money still hasn't arrived in the other part of the world. And when it finally does get over there, significant fees, significant percentages have been taken off the top.
I mean, haven't companies already solved that? I mean, there's a company called Wise, for example, that works in 170 countries, and they transfer the money almost immediately with very low fees, right?
Some do, but I guess the point is, it also assumes a level of penetration of sort of access to bank accounts and other kinds of technologies, other kinds of ability to access money that is not always necessarily the case in every part of the world. And so that is at least one of the use cases that we've been seeing, is the sort of more efficient, more frictionless transfer of value across borders. But again, with that comes concerns about, KYC, about anti-money laundering, making sure that, illicit actors, including terrorists, aren't in the middle of all of that. Because the more that you move away from the traditional international, banking system, the more potential concerns there are that you're dealing with illicit actors. That's not to say that the traditional system has solved all these problems, right? And there are plenty of issues with the way that the current system is set up, where there is, plenty of money laundering, plenty of terrorist financing, et cetera. But one very legitimate concern in this new world of internet-based money is that we don't know exactly who's behind what. The other thing I would say, and this is not an area that I'm personally, directly involved in, but you talk about DeFi, you talk about, decentralized finance, and the ability to pool capital in a way that really hasn't been done before and deploy it for new and exciting projects. And the way of, potentially, again, using code as a means of intermediating transactions and sort of automating a lot of what otherwise just takes a lot of people, a lot of lawyers, a lot of, sort of people in the middle. It's in many ways inefficient. It creates opportunities for corruption, for extracting value in ways that are not actually helpful to consumers. So I think that's what the ultimate vision is. The other vision is also of data, right? Having people allow themselves to control data rather than having impersonal third parties controlling their sensitive data for them. And, we're awash in data in many ways, and people's identities are just sort of out there. I think one promise of, it's not just crypto, but really of distributed ledger technology generally, is on the one hand, keeping data out of any one person's hands, right? Any one intermediary, any one company, while at the same time being able to let people sort of use that data as they wish. That's the vision. Obviously, we have a long way to go to get there.
On that note, do you have a point of view from like business associations class, like the DAO, the Decentralized Autonomous Organization, doesn't really have shareholders or management. It's a protocol. So in our traditional financial system, you have like fiduciary duties, like the managers have to deal with the money properly, but DAOs, it's a protocol. So you see that coming up against like the Tornado Cash instance where, can you sanction a whole protocol? There's no like entity on top of that protocol. Yes, there are like gateways and on-ramps, but, is the DAO something that the law can't touch?
So look, this is one of the really interesting questions, right? The state of Wyoming has tried to sort of create the DAO or the DAO entity so that you can sort of register yourself as a DAO, get at least some of the benefits of that decentralized governance, while also getting some of the benefits of being an LLC, which is ultimately why, many people try to create LLCs is to limit potential liability. And, it's just a little bit of a digression here, but, it's so interesting to see that Wyoming is where some of these corporate law innovations are taking place. The LLC was created in Wyoming in the late 1970s, sort of a reaction to the oil crises of the 1970s. And so, it's just very interesting to see how you do need to be a little bit innovative when it comes to corporate structures to help create sort of business governance principles that can sort of build you into the future. DAOs, again, as a concept are fascinating because of that flat structure. It's very much kind of consistent with this idea of decentralization, of letting sort of people make decisions for themselves rather than having them imposed on them. And yet, Sarah, you made a very good point. From a practical point of view, if you're an entity, you need somebody to help guide you, right? You need someone in charge. You need someone to help sort of make the decisions. And, so far DAOs have tried to have a situation where they have majority votes, but even that sometimes is sort of subject to manipulation. So it's, I guess, a little bit of a long answer. My view is it's fascinating to see these new forms of organization, whether it's personal organization, corporate organization, in order to deploy capital or to collect capital and build them towards new projects, right? So, to the extent that, again, the LLC is actually not that old an institution, 30, 40 years old, created in Wyoming, didn't really exist before that. And look where we are today in terms of how, that principle of corporation law has created all sorts of, positive impacts in the world. I am actually very curious and excited to see where DAOs go. But I would be the first to admit, with you, that we haven't quite seen that form of organization sort of get it completely right yet.
I guess you could think the foundation, there is a foundation and a pot of money, and then it gets to money or the profit motive, like then you get into securities law. Is the DAO issuing a security in order to fund itself? And then you go into SEC land, which was my next question for you. Do you have a point of view about jurisdiction? The SEC, CFTC, or leave it to the states? Or is it just this complex that, financial regulation is complex? You have banks, you have the White House, comptroller, you have the Federal Reserve, you have SEC, you have CFTC. So is that just a natural outspringing of financial networks? We're going to have everybody involved in crypto, just like in money?
Well, look, to the extent that what we're talking about right now has the transformative potential to completely reshape the American economy, if not the global economy, right? It's not surprising to me that different sets of regulators have different sets of concerns. And, if you look at President Biden's executive order on digital assets issued a few months ago, and now we're starting to see some of those reports come in, there are so many parts of the federal government that are touched by digital assets one way or the other. You mentioned, many of them, SEC, CFTC, the OCC, I'm an alum of the Justice Department, which also has a very strong interest here. You've got Treasury and all of its various components, whether it's IRS, whether it's FinCEN, whether it's OFAC. And then, as you mentioned, the state regulators have also been actually quite active. New York DFS is very active in this space. We've seen some state securities regulators getting very, very interested. You've got the CFPB, coming in with sort of the consumer protection angle. So it's not surprising to me that different regulators who have, strong mandates, strong congressional authorization to do what they're doing, to be interested. The question, that when people ask me sort of SEC versus CFTC, and I think this might have come up in our discussion in Aspen over the summer, Sarah, you might recall, my own view is I'm personally I'm a little bit agnostic. And maybe that derives from my background as a criminal prosecutor, because DOJ in some sense sits above or separate from all of this, right? If there's a violation of criminal law, the Justice Department has basically exclusive jurisdiction and actually works with each of the component agencies that you talked about to build cases. My own view, and this maybe again comes from my background as a national security official, I just worry that, in the United States, we spend so much time talking about the different, regulatory agencies and where their interests overlap or what their jurisdiction is, that we lose sight of the fact that a lot of the innovation in this space is happening, or at least being driven out of the United States. The longer we take to come up with a clear regulatory framework for everything that we've been talking about, the more incentive there is for the truly innovative people in this area to leave the United States or go elsewhere. And we've already seen that. In fact, many prominent Americans have set up shop outside the United States because of their concern about kind of the lack of clarity or regulation by enforcement, or, just not having a very clear set of principles of how to build their businesses in this area. And the reason why that matters is that, when it comes to distributed ledger technology, when it comes to crypto or other, adjacent concepts, we want to make sure that the world that we're building is infused with American values or Western values or rule of law values, however you want to characterize it. And, there are other parts of the world that have spent a lot of time thinking about these technologies, have used them as organs of state power, are sort of using, again, DLT, distributed ledger technology, if not crypto necessarily, but the concept of central bank digital currencies to essentially export their own values or their own approach to the world. And again, the danger is the longer we take here in the United States to try to figure these issues out, we're almost ceding leadership on a lot of these issues to other parts of the world that may not share our values, may not share our values when it comes to content, being content neutral, or free speech, or the free flow of ideas, or the free flow of money. And I think we could all of a sudden find ourselves, 15, 20 years from now in a very unpleasant place because we fail to grasp leadership on these issues today. So again, that's not to say that these very important questions about regulatory authority, regulatory jurisdiction shouldn't be discussed. They need to be discussed. They need to be addressed correctly. But the longer it takes for us, I guess the point I'm trying to make is we run the risk of falling behind other nations. And in the very same way that the United States was a leader in building the internet, in the 1990s, for all of its flaws, at the end of the day, the internet is a kind of, American-led technology. It's infused with American values. The danger is if we don't assert a similar kind of leadership when it comes to Web3 or when it comes to, the sort of payment issues that we're talking about today, we could be at a significant disadvantage.
So I guess with that, innovation moves faster than regulators. Arguably, could you say, though, that the U.S. is doing pretty well? I mean, USDC Circle's stablecoin has made transparent their balance sheet. They hold a lot of treasuries backing their stablecoin. I don't know of other countries or stablecoins that have that much transparency. So I think part of the concern for regulators is stability, financial stability, protecting consumers. So you have all these scams, Celsius and Voyager, that are insolvent. There's questions about if FTX's balance sheet is solid. But then you have these brighter spots like the stablecoin that is voluntarily solid, or, saying that they hold treasuries to back their coin. I guess that's the balance between regulators demanding it and then companies voluntarily doing it. Would you say other countries have stablecoins that are as stable as USDC?
I would not. And it's a great example. And look, I think stablecoins are one area where the United States not only is a leader, but can continue to be a leader, right? I can certainly see a world in which stablecoin adoption goes into parts of the world where the US sort of financial system has not even really penetrated. And so to get to the point that I was making earlier about sort of establishing an international global financial system that's infused with sort of our values rather than competing values, this is one way in which digital assets or crypto can actually, expand the reach of US values, right? Increase adoption of stablecoins in parts of the world that are actually not traditionally part of the US financial system, and then allowing the market to expand, right? Allowing the market to meet those needs. That's a fundamentally American way of expanding prosperity, of expanding our values. And so, I mean, to your point, Sarah, I could see that area being one area in which we as a country do sort of expand appropriately our economic influence. The danger is that there are, as I mentioned, other parts of the world that are sort of less focused on stablecoins, but have been quite aggressive in advancing a CBDC, a central bank digital currency, and using that as a means of trying to gain leverage over other nations. The ECNY is the Chinese central sort of digital currency. Hasn't yet had a huge impact outside of China's borders, but that is certainly part of the Chinese government's plan, right? And they've already done a lot of domestic work on their central bank digital currency that's very concerning. I mean, it is absolutely an instrument of state control. Increasingly, you have to use, the ECNY to do any kind of local transaction. The government is essentially watching what you're buying, where you're buying it, how you're buying it, in what quantities, at what time of day. And it gets inserted into the Chinese citizen's social credit score. And I mean, that has not only its own kind of Orwellian, concerns, but it has very practical impacts as well, because once the government has total insight into what a person is doing at all times, what they're buying, there's just no zone of privacy. There's no kind of personal sense of ownership. Everything becomes an instrument of the state. And again, once it's inserted into your social credit score, the state can make all sorts of decisions on your behalf or cut you off from certain services or certain ability to do certain things. And that vision is, the plan is to export that vision outside of China's borders into the developing world, where, increasingly China sees distributed ledger technology as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. As they're building infrastructure in parts of the world that are outside of China, you link it to the central currency, and all of a sudden now Beijing has insight into financial flows and financial activity that's happening outside of its borders. And again, because of the, lack of restraint when it comes to censorship or other kinds of more sort of aggressive action, all of a sudden now, the unit of currency has become part of the ability to control. So that's, as an American citizen and as somebody who was involved in U.S. national security issues when I served in the government, that's what actually drew me to this industry, is the ability to help build something that is infused with sort of free ideals, right? With liberty, rather than this potential for great sort of totalitarian activity.
So when it's a distributed ledger, and so the person controls their own information, doesn't this mean that the person has to keep their password? And we hear all these stories of somebody who bought Bitcoin early on and then remembered they had it and can't find the password, so they're lost. And if there's a system that helps them remember that password, doesn't that then destroy the whole point of the person controlling it?
Yeah, it's a good question, Scott. And I will admit that there are technological answers to your question that are satisfying. And I wish I knew it off the top of my head exactly what they are, but that's actually where we're seeing a lot of the innovation. It's in digital identity, using blockchains to store personal information so that only you can access it, zero knowledge proofs, using mathematics and cryptography to truly make it sort of that on-off switch where only you have access to it, but not one of those situations where you've got to remember, 48 different passwords to do what you have to do. So it's a little bit, again, analogizing back to the internet, now we have a situation where you can sort of pretty easily log into your, whatever it is, your personal email account. But if you go back to back in the 90s, maybe at the very early days, you'd have to sort of go through Unix, and sort of type everything in and remember all the code. That is where a lot of the innovation is happening now, is making those user interfaces for, remembering the information you need to remember, but not so that it's this very burdensome kind of thing.
So again, like just biometrics or something that doesn't change.
That's right. That's right. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of companies that are working on exactly the issue that you just described. I wish I had the technical background to explain it, but that's certainly where a lot of the innovation is.
That's okay. I don't have the technical background to understand it, so we're good.
Well, talking about technology, I thought maybe we could talk more about your TRM Labs software. So the premise is, I think, is monitoring the public blockchains for where money's going and moving in order to identify fraud or illicit payments. So isn't there a tension there between transparency, like the blockchains are really transparent and privacy?
So let me answer your question, Sarah. But if you don't mind, I'll just back up a little bit and say just a little bit about sort of what we do and sort of how that helps inform my answer to your question. So TRM is a blockchain intelligence company. As you described it, we have great insight into data, trillions and trillions of transactions that are taking place on the blockchain every single day. And so, we have visibility, and this is all sort of public information about where money flows are happening across 25 different blockchains. So, most folks are familiar with the Bitcoin network. That's the most sort of well-known, prominent crypto network. But Bitcoin was, is quite old, when it comes to crypto. And since that time, there have been numerous other blockchains that have developed. And you folks have probably heard of Solana or Ethereum, obviously, and many others. And so we have unique visibility into about 25, 26 different blockchains and are able to see transfer of funds across those blockchains. The reason why that matters is, as you mentioned, if there are fraud cases where people are moving, criminals are moving funds across different blockchains in an effort to launder funds or to hide. There are also, of course, legitimate uses of moving across different blockchains for privacy reasons. And maybe this is the direct answer to your question, Sarah. You're absolutely right that at least permissionless blockchains, public blockchains, are basically transparent. You don't even need TRM, tools for that. You can use a blockchain sort of explorer and see where different funds move across different blockchains. And that is publicly available. That is fully transparent. But there are ways to protect your privacy in this world of transparent blockchains. Number one is the blockchain itself. We as a company don't store any personal information. Everything that we're looking at is public blockchain data. So unlike a bank, which needs your name and your, driver's license number and your address and your phone number and this and that, none of that is stored in our tool, because all that we care about is the public blockchain, Bitcoin address or Solana address or whatever it is. And so you can start to see why, in some ways, the blockchain can be transformative when it comes to privacy issues. And when you combine that with a little bit of what Scott and I were talking about earlier about sort of turning on and off data that's necessary for particular uses, you can start to see why the blockchain is actually transformative when it comes to privacy issues. Rather than, the example that people often use is, if you want to get into a bar, you have to show that you're 21 years old. And now that involves showing up, they look at your face, you've got your driver's license, which of course has all this other personal information on it before somebody will let you in. I can imagine a world in which, through the use of, again, cryptography or zero knowledge proofs or other types of mathematical concepts, you're able to sort of demonstrate that you are over 21 years old simply by showing up and presenting a particular form of ID or information that is stored on a blockchain. And that doesn't require the other person to see exactly what your birth date is or exactly where you live or who you are. It's just enough to confirm that you are who you are and that you meet that yes or no binary question of, am I older than 21 years old on this particular day? That's the world towards which we are moving. And so think about how almost liberating that concept is for privacy issues. You don't have all these vast amounts of personal data being stored just inertly on databases, and not just one database. Think about how many databases out there in the world have your personal information on it, whether it's your bank, whether it's your credit card, whether it's, every, shopping website, grocery website, whatever it is. Think about all the different places where huge amounts of personal data are just sitting there stored, maybe encrypted, but they're just sitting there. They're honeypots. They're waiting to be hacked. The blockchain provides at least the vision of getting rid of that entire sort of model that we've sort of fallen into as a society, as a global society. So that's one way in which blockchains can actually be very privacy protective.
But aside from, the technology enabling to separate all that other demographic data from the transaction, like Scott said earlier, won't companies want to combine their transaction data with, their profiles of consumers? It's hard to understand why the technology would change business behavior. Unless the consumer wants to block a company from knowing more about them. So I think the question always boils back to use case. So just because it's possible doesn't mean that it's actually going to be useful or profitable. And then I guess going more towards the cybercrime angle, what do you see your clients like wanting to know about? Like, are they just monitoring flows, or what are their concerns?
Yeah. Well, let me answer your last question first. So, we have sort of three basic verticals when it comes to customers: governments, and we'll talk about them in a second; financial institutions, and we can talk about them in a second; and then crypto native institutions is